Imagine an enormous bullet-shaped spaceship weighing 10,000 tons and towering 100 meters into the sky. Suddenly, there's a searing flash of light as the craft is enveloped in a giant atomic fireball. But when the light dims, the ship has not been vaporized. Rather, it has been lifted several hundred meters off the ground. It hangs in midair for a split second before the sky is once again flooded with light, the blast lofting the ship even higher. Another blast follows, and another, until the craft is rocketing through the sky at tremendous speed, sailing past the Earth's atmosphere and eventually its gravitational pull. While this scene might seem straight out of a particularly cheesy 1950s sci-fi movie, it came astonishingly close to becoming reality. For nearly a decade, a group of American scientists attempted to build a giant interplanetary spacecraft propelled by the detonations of thousands of atomic bombs. But while ultimately this effort never got off the ground, it was not nearly as insane as it might seem. Indeed, even today, so-called nuclear pulse propulsion remains our only practical means of overcoming the limitations of conventional rocketry and venturing out into the solar system and beyond. This is the incredible, forgotten story of Project Orion.
Just before we get back to Simon discussing one of the coolest projects mankind has ever attempted, you know who else is at the epicenter of cool projects? Today's sponsor, Squarespace, the all-in-one platform that turns your someday I'll make a website into wow, did I just build that? Darn skippy. Whether you're launching a business, starting a blog, selling merch, or showcasing your work, Squarespace makes it ridiculously easy. Start with one of their award-winning templates or let Blueprint AI build a custom layout tailored to your brand, style, and goal. It's like having your own website designer, but without the awkward video calls where you have to interact with another human. Gross. Or the invoice that makes you cry both because of the amount and because paying it is an executive function skill, and who has time for that? Nobody. But with Squarespace, you just answer a few quick questions about what you're trying to do, sell stuff, grow your brand, showcase your genius. No code, no stress, just drag, drop, and done. No human interaction required. And don't worry about visibility. Squarespace handles the search engine optimization for you, from meta descriptions to page structure to automatic sitemaps. Their built-in tools optimize your site so search engines actually know you exist. But wait, there's more. With Squarespace email campaigns, you can send beautiful automated emails that keep your audience engaged and your sales rolling. Promote a new product, book more clients, or send updates, or promote a new client who specializes in updates. If you can dream it, you can achieve it with Squarespace. And when it comes time to track results, Squarespace has got you covered there as well, thanks to real-time analytics where you'll get clear insights into your audience, traffic, and sales so you can make smarter decisions, grow faster, and finally no longer be a terrible disappointment to your mother. Because much like me 16 years ago when I started all of this, I made a website and made my mama proud. Or possibly made her wonder why I had racked up $80,000 in student loan debt on my computer science education only to throw it down the tubes so I could talk about facts online. But much like Ray Kinsella, if you build it, they will come, and here we are. Checkmate, Mom. Bottom line, Squarespace gives you everything you need to thrive online, all in one powerful, easy-to-use platform. Head to squarespace.com/brainfood for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, use offer code BRAINFOOD to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain and help support our channel at the same time. Everybody wins. Now let's get back to Simon diving into the crazy cool world of nuclear-powered rockets.
The idea of propelling a vehicle using explosives, it dates back to at least the 1890s when German inventor Hermann Gansfeld first proposed sending a rocket into space using sequential dynamite charges. However, the concept of using nuclear explosives would not appear until nearly half a century later, springing from the fertile mind of Polish mathematician Stanislaw Ulam. Born in 1909 to a wealthy Jewish family, Ulam moved to the United States in 1939 to escape the Nazis, and in 1943 was invited to join the Manhattan Project, the top-secret effort to build the first atomic bomb. Assigned to the project's main laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico, Ulam worked on the implosion-type bomb design, performing hydrodynamic calculations for the high-explosive lenses that would compress the weapon's plutonium core to criticality. These efforts paid off when, in the early morning hours of July 16, 1945, the world's first atomic bomb, codenamed Trinity, or simply the Gadget, was detonated at Alamogordo, unleashing the equivalent explosive power of 25,000 tons of TNT. 1 month later, on August 9th, a nearly identical bomb, codenamed Fat Man, was dropped on the Japanese city of Nagasaki, killing an estimated 80,000 people. At the same time, Ulam began working with the Hungarian physicist Edward Teller on the design of an even more powerful bomb, which Teller dubbed the Super. This used a conventional atomic bomb to heat and compress a mass of deuterium and tritium, heavy isotopes of hydrogen, to trigger a nuclear fusion reaction and boost the weapon's yield from kilotons to megatons. While early calculations showed the concept to be infeasible, in 1951 Teller and Ulam came up with a workable design which was successfully tested on November 1st, 1952 in the Ivy Mike nuclear test at Enowetok Atoll in the South Pacific. The so-called Teller-Ulam design forms the basis of every thermonuclear or hydrogen bomb in use today. But while the atomic bomb and hydrogen bombs were originally created as weapons of war, in the post-war period, nuclear scientists began exploring more peaceful applications for their creations. These efforts led to Project Plowshare in the United States and nuclear explosions for the national economy in the Soviet Union, which investigated the practicality of using nuclear explosives for, among other things, digging harbors and canals, stimulating oil and gas production, generating electricity, and even putting out oil well fires. Another early proposed application of nuclear power was in rocket propulsion for both military weapons and the peaceful exploration of space. At first, such efforts focused on the use of lightweight nuclear reactors to heat a working fluid, which was then expelled through a nozzle to generate thrust. Such designs have numerous advantages over conventional chemical rocket engines. First, nuclear fission has an energy density more than 1 million times higher than even the most energetic chemical reactions. Second, even the lightest chemical rocket propellants like hydrogen and oxygen invariably produce combustion products heavier than the original reactants, in this case water. As thrust is proportional to the velocity of the rocket's engine exhaust, which in turn is inversely proportional to the mass of the molecules in said exhaust, this places an upper limit on the performance achievable with chemical propellants. Nuclear rocket engines, on the other hand, can use hydrogen, the lightest of all elements, directly as a working fluid, allowing them to achieve a specific impulse, that is, thrust per mass of propellant consumed per second, more than twice that of chemical rocket engines. Research on such engines began in 1955 under the Atomic Energy Commission, or AEC's Project Rover, though when the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, was founded in 1958, the project was transferred over and renamed Nuclear Engine for Rocket Vehicle Application, or NERVA. Among other applications, NERVA was originally intended to power the upper stage of the Nova and Saturn V rockets, then being designed to carry astronauts to the moon. But while the basic principle of a nuclear rocket engine is simple, Rover and NERVA engineers quickly discovered just how difficult it is to implement in practice. Perhaps the greatest challenge was dealing with the huge amounts of lethal radiation given off by the reactor, as well as finding construction materials both light enough to fly and strong enough to withstand the forces of flight and the high temperatures in the core. Indeed, this proved the key limiting factor of the entire concept. The hotter the working fluid, the more efficient the engine, but as material limitations capped the core temperature at around 1600 degrees Celsius, much of the tremendous energy potential of nuclear rocket propulsion remained untapped. However, Stanislav Ulam had already come up with a unique, if radical, solution to this problem. Instead of releasing the power of nuclear fission continuously, as in a reactor, to propel a spaceship, why not release it instantaneously using atomic bombs? Such nuclear pulse propulsion, he reasoned, would be far more efficient than NERVA, for the spacecraft's structure would absorb only a tiny amount of heat produced by each detonation, allowing more thrust to be produced. Ulam first wrote down his ideas in 1944, a full year before the Trinity test, and further refined them in a 1947 memorandum co-authored with Frederick Rains, and again in 1955 in a still classified paper written with Cornelius Everett. Others also proposed similar ideas around the same time. For example, engineers at the Glenn L. Martin Company of Santa Ana, California, came up with a nuclear pulse engine with a combustion chamber 40 meters in diameter into which small nuclear charges with yields of around 100 tons of TNT would be injected at a rate of around 1 per second. At the same time, water would be injected to serve as a working fluid, the resulting plasma being vented out a conventional rocket nozzle to generate thrust. This design was calculated to yield a specific impulse of 1,150 seconds, nearly 3 times that of the Rocketdyne J2 hydrogen-oxygen engine used in the upper stage of the S4B stage of the Saturn V. However, due to the large amount of radioactive fallout that would likely be produced by the thousands of rapidly detonating atomic bombs, Martin originally planned to boost its vehicle with conventional chemical rockets to an altitude of 240 kilometers, whereupon the nuclear pulse engine would take over and impart an extra 2,400 meters per second of Delta-V energy, enough to escape the Earth's gravity and propel the spacecraft out into the solar system. But while theoretically workable, Martin's designs required a very heavy combustion chamber and support structure to withstand the force of the bombs detonating within. Stanislav Ulam and his various collaborators saw this as unnecessary and inefficient and instead proposed an alternative external combustion design. In this scheme, the nuclear charges would be ejected out of the rear of the spacecraft along with disks of solid fuel. The detonating charges would vaporize the fuel, creating an expanding plume of hot plasma that would impinge on a large metal pusher plate at the rear of the craft, propelling it forward. As there was no need to contain the blasts, much higher yield charges could be used and even higher specific impulse values achieved, up to a whopping 100,000 seconds. Ulam's ideas floated around the nuclear community for several years before coming to the attention of physicist Ted Taylor of General Atomics in San Diego. Taylor specialized in the design of compact nuclear warheads, technology that would be key to the creation of nuclear pulse-powered spacecraft. Furthermore, the Soviet Union had just humiliated the United States by launching Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite into orbit. Taylor saw a nuclear-powered spacecraft as the ideal means of re-establishing American prestige and leapfrogging the Soviets in the nascent space race. Early on, Taylor recognized that a nuclear-powered spacecraft project would not get very far without official government support. So, in July 1958, he approached the U.S. Department of Defense's Advanced Research Project Agency, or ARPA, today the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, and convinced them to fund preliminary research to the tune of $1 million a year. Under the codename Project Orion, Taylor began assembling a team of the country's brightest mathematicians, physicists, and engineers, including Stanislav Ulam, Jaromir Jerry Astol, a Czech-born aeronautical engineer and explosives expert, and British-born theoretical physicist Freeman Dyson, whom General Atomics founder Frederick de Hoffman convinced to take a one-year sabbatical from the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. And if that name sounds familiar, no, he's not the vacuum cleaner guy, but he's rather the guy who's the namesake of the Dyson Sphere, a hypothetical megastructure built by a hyper-advanced civilization around a star in order to capture all of its energy. These men were drawn to Project Orion for a variety of reasons. Some simply dreamed of exploring the solar system, while others saw the unique engineering challenges of the project as, in the words of the father of the atomic bomb, J. Robert Oppenheimer, technically sweet. Still others, guilty of the devastation and global tension wrought by the atomic bomb, viewed Iran as a means of redeeming the creation they'd helped bring into the world. Equally enticing was the organization of the project, which Taylor modeled after the Verein für Raumschifffahrt, or Society for Space Travel, the German rocket society of the 1920s and 30s, which counted among its members a young Werner von Braun, later chief engineer behind the V-2 ballistic missile and Saturn V moon rocket. Like the VFR, the Orion project adopted a flat organizational structure, with few hierarchies and little division of labor between its members. Researchers were free to collaborate and tinker across disciplines as they pleased. Whatever the case, Orion represented a fundamental break from the usual engineering philosophy for spacecraft, for unlike chemical rockets, nuclear-powered spacecraft actually became more efficient the larger they were built. As project engineer Harris Mayer explained in a 2003 interview, "I can remember very well when Ted Taylor first explained the Orion idea. He said the nuclear bomb is so strong that if you have a standard-sized spaceship of the type we were thinking about for chemical propellants, the acceleration that you would have, the force on the small mass, would be so large it would pulverize the spaceship." He said, "Let's make it big. Let's make it, instead of a few tons, let's make it a few thousand tons. And this means, with the same force, you would have much less acceleration. Because it has to be so big, we should change the way we think of spacecraft. Instead of them being designed for the minimum possible weight with just the right strength, which means very fragile, for the operation, let's make it in a standard engineering design, built like the Brooklyn Bridge or a building. Let's make it out of steel, just ordinary steel, and let's make everything about it, life support systems, like a hotel." End quote. Indeed, the Orion team initially proposed contracting construction of the spacecraft to the Electric Boat Division of General Dynamics, which had built much of the US Navy's nuclear-powered submarine fleet. The vast engineering latitude afforded by nuclear pulse propulsion would allow astronauts to do things that were unthinkable using chemical rockets, such as establishing a Mars colony in a single 4-week mission, or reaching the outer planets in as little as 7 months. Indeed, Project Orion's unofficial motto was Mars by 1965, Saturn by 1970. Freeman Dyson estimated the development cost of the project at a surprisingly reasonable $100 million per year over 12 years. While this did not factor in the cost of peripheral technology such as spacesuits and scientific instruments, Dyson anticipated that Orion would piggyback off the work of other military and NASA space projects. But even if he had underestimated Orion's cost by an order of magnitude, the final total would still have only come out to around $24 billion. about the same as the Apollo program. And despite the use of nuclear technologies, the fueling costs would also have been roughly on par. While nuclear explosives are expensive, with the average warhead in the US nuclear arsenal costing $1.1 million on average, much of this cost is bound up in the extensive infrastructure of reactors, fuel refining plants, and assembly facilities needed to produce them. Once this upfront investment has been made, the cost of producing additional warheads drops considerably. With suitable refinements, the Orion team estimated that simple, low-yield pulse units could be mass-produced for around $500,000 each. Assuming 1,000 pulse units are needed to lift a payload of 10,000 tons into Earth orbit, this translates to a fueling cost of around $50 per kilogram of payload. By comparison, the Saturn V could carry only 141 tons into low Earth orbit and cost $1.42 million to fuel, a fueling cost of around $10 per kilogram. When all other costs were taken into account, Orion became even more attractive, offering launch costs of $500 per kilogram compared to nearly $10,000 using modern chemical rockets. But before any of this could become a reality, a great many technical problems first had to be overcome. For example, the exploding nuclear pulse units would produce a plume of plasma at temperatures of tens of millions of degrees Celsius, traveling at speeds of up to 31,000 meters per second, and each time the plume impacted the spacecraft's pusher plate, it would burn and ablate away a thin layer from the surface. Thankfully, there was evidence to suggest that this problem was not as serious as it appeared. Following early nuclear tests at the Nevada test site, Ted Taylor had walked around Ground Zero, picking up pieces of the steel shot towers used to detonate the bombs. To his surprise, every piece could be accounted for, shattered, but not vaporized. Later, during nuclear tests on Enewetak Atoll, Orion physicist Lou Allen had conducted an experiment codenamed Project Viper, in which he hung a set of 1-meter diameter graphite-covered steel spheres on steel wires 10 meters away from a 10-kiloton atomic bomb. Following the blast, the spheres were recovered several kilometers away, but completely intact, only a few micrometers of graphite having been ablated from their surfaces. Further calculations and physical tests conducted using an explosively driven helium plasma generator revealed that as the pusher plate would only be exposed to the plasma from the propelling bombs for around 1 millisecond per pulse, meant that cheap ordinary metals like steel and aluminium were more than durable enough for the job. Later physicists like Freeman Dyson would propose making the pusher plate out of uranium or other heavy elements so that the neutrons from the nuclear pulse units would breed the material into reactor fuel to power a Moon or Mars colony. Other researchers also came up with methods of spraying the pusher plate with graphite or oil between pulses, further reducing or even completely eliminating ablation. Interestingly, this technique was developed entirely by accident when researchers accidentally left oily fingerprints on a test plate and discovered that those areas did not ablate. But even if the pusher plate could survive the detonations, Orion's crew might not, for each pulse would accelerate the Orion spacecraft by up to 100 Gs. That's far more than a human could withstand. Some sort of shock-absorbing system was thus needed to convert these pulses into a smoother, more survivable acceleration. This task was taken up by Jaromir Jerry Astor, who had served in the Czech resistance during the Second World War and was an expert on explosives. Working at Naval Base Point Loma near San Diego, Astor suspended small-scale models of the Orion spacecraft from a tower and detonated 1-pound balls of plastic explosive beneath them. At first, Astor developed a simple shock absorber composed of stacked rubber inner tubes, only to realize that if one of the pulse units failed, the recoiling pusher plate would tear this airbag to pieces. He thus switched to a 2-stage spring and shock absorber design similar to that used in cars. The first-stage shock absorber was tuned to 4.5 times the explosive pulse frequency, and the second stage to half this frequency, allowing the timing of the explosions to be off by as much as 10 milliseconds. These tests and further calculations confirmed that with properly designed shock absorbers, the 100G nuclear pulses could feasibly be reduced to a far more tolerable 2 to 4 Gs. As one Orion engineer humorously described it, it would be like flying a giant pogo stick into space. Astor also determined that since most of the energy from each pulse would impact the center of the pusher plate, the plate could be made to taper out towards the edges, providing maximum strength for minimum weight. But perhaps the most difficult technical problem to crack was the design of the nuclear pulse units themselves. Early on, Ted Taylor rejected Stanislav Ulam's cumbersome propellant disc concept and combined the bomb and reaction mass into a single unit. The shape of the reaction mass was vital to achieving maximum propulsive efficiency. A regular cylindrical mass creates a flat disc-shaped plasma wave whose energy is mostly directed sideways and away from the pusher plate. Thus, Taylor and the other Orion physicists devised what was effectively a nuclear-shaped charge, which used specially shaped tungsten, uranium, and beryllium oxide guides and fillers to shape X-rays and plasma from the detonating warhead into a long cigar-shaped plasma jet, directing as much energy as possible onto the pusher plate. Another major concern was metal shrapnel from the bomb casing impacting and potentially damaging the pusher plate. For this reason, several alternative materials were proposed for the reaction mass, including polyethylene, plywood, and fiberglass resin. Polyethylene was particularly stable as it easily absorbs neutrons and breaks down into lightweight hydrogen and carbon atoms, producing extremely high exhaust velocities. Much thought was also devoted to the optimum explosive yield for the pulse units. At first, the Orion researchers based their decisions on the smallest yields then achievable using available technology, which was around 0.1 kilotons. Such minuscule warheads had been developed by the US military for use in air-to-air missiles like the AIM-26 Falcon and Air-2 Genie, and portable infantry weapons like the M388 Davy Crockett Recalless Rifle and the Special Atomic Demolition Munition, or SADM. The smaller the pulse unit, the less jarring the acceleration of each pulse would be, though at the cost of having to carry many more pulse units. If a given pulse unit failed or more thrust was needed, additional or more powerful pulse units would be ejected from the spacecraft. At the time, the technology to vary the yield of an atomic bomb by injecting tritium into its core, what's variously known as boosting or dialer yield, was still in its infancy, so the Orion team envisioned carrying multiple varieties of pulse units with different yields, which would be swapped in and ejected at a moment's notice in order to maintain the desired propulsion profile. To achieve this complex mechanical task, Orion engineers consulted with the Coca-Cola Company, hoping to adapt the high-speed machinery used in bottling plants. After many experiments and calculations, the Orion team finally drew up a baseline design for a prototype manned Orion spacecraft measuring 72 meters or around 16 stories high and 42 meters in diameter and weighing 4,000 tons. A ground launch was envisioned, the production of radioactive fallout being mitigated through the use of either a thick metal launch pad or by launching the vehicle from a barge in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The nuclear pulse units would be launched at a frequency of 1 per second, detonating around 30 meters behind the pusher plate. At first, smaller 0.15 kiloton pulse units would be used, but as the vehicle rose higher and the atmosphere became thinner, more powerful 0.2 kiloton units would be swapped in. It was estimated between 800 and 1,000 pulse units would be needed to reach Earth orbit. Various systems were proposed for launching the pulse units, including multiple guns poking over the rim of the pusher plate or rocket-propelled bombs launching from rails, but ultimately a single pneumatic gun mounted in the middle of the pusher plate was found to be perfectly adequate. Yet despite this theoretical process, one major practical question remained unanswered. Would such a craft be stable on ascent, or would variations in the position of the bombs relative to the pusher plate cause it to careen wildly through the air? To find out, Jerry Astle and other Orion engineers built and tested a series of scale-working models dubbed hot rods or put-puts, propelled by regular explosive charges. In the most spectacular of these tests, conducted at Point Loma on November 14, 1959, a hot rod launched itself 56 meters into the air using 6 sequenced explosions before returning to the Earth by parachute, the whole flight lasting 23 seconds. Despite the team's fears, the vehicle stayed perfectly upright throughout the test and needed no additional stabilization systems. There was no doubt any longer. The Orion concept was sound. But just as Orion was starting to come together, the rug was suddenly pulled from under the project. As covered in our previous video, the genius who attempted to launch satellites using an absolutely ginormous gun, early in the space race, the US Army, Navy, and Air Force all jockeyed for control of America's spaceflight efforts, with the Army's Redstone missile launching America's first satellite, Explorer 1, and the Navy's Vanguard rocket its second, Vanguard 1. However, following the formation of NASA in July 1958, the United States government decided to consolidate all civilian spaceflight programs with that agency, and all military programs with the Air Force, leaving Orion as the only spaceflight project under ARPA's umbrella. In late 1959, the agency decided to withdraw its funding, leaving the Orion project scrambling to find a new benefactor. As Orion had been intended from the start for peaceful space exploration, the team initially turned to NASA. There they found an enthusiastic supporter in Werner von Braun, then director of the Marshall Space Flight Center, who reportedly fell out of his chair when shown footage of the November 14th hot rod test. However, von Braun was unable to convince NASA management to support the project. The use of nuclear weapons, by necessity, implied a certain degree of secrecy, whereas, as a civilian agency, NASA was committed to complete transparency. So while the agency agreed to provide a small amount of funding for further studies, this was nowhere near enough to build a working Orion prototype. Ted Taylor and company thus had no choice but to turn to the US Air Force, who agreed to fund the project if a viable military application could be found. Desperate to keep the project alive, the Orion team dutifully concocted outlandish concepts for giant Orion-based space battleships that would fly in polar orbit, allowing them to bombard any point on the Earth's surface using nuclear warhead launchers. These concepts attracted the attention of General Thomas S. Parr, the head of the Air Force's Strategic Air Command, or SAC, who declared, "Whoever controls Orion controls the world." This enthusiasm, however, was short-lived. Given the limitations of early 1960s guidance technology, accurately hitting enemy targets from orbit would have been exceedingly challenging. Furthermore, both the US and the Soviet Union were developing intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, capable of placing multi-megaton warheads anywhere on Earth for far cheaper than an Orion-style orbiting platform, rendering the whole concept effectively worthless. Indeed, US Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara was particularly unenthusiastic about Orion, while President John F. Kennedy, when shown a scale model of the Orion battleship in late 1963, reportedly recoiled in horror. The project was dealt another serious blow that same year when the United States, Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty, banning the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. These factors convinced the Air Force to drop the project, forcing Ted Taylor to return once more to NASA and Wernher von Braun. By this time, President Kennedy had announced the ambitious goal of landing a man on the moon by the end of the decade, and von Braun was consumed by the development of the massive Saturn V rocket that would carry them there. Due to the limited test ban treaty, the Orion team decided to abandon their original ground launch concept and instead boost the prototype Orion into space atop a Saturn V booster, whereupon the nuclear pulse engine would take over. This required them to significantly scale down the vehicle to a diameter of only 10 meters and a mass of 90 tons. This, in turn, limited the craft's specific impulse to only 1,800 to 2,500 seconds. Very low by nuclear propulsion standards, but far beyond the capabilities of regular rocket engines. Furthermore, up to 45% of the spacecraft's mass would have been useful as payload, as compared to less than 5% for the Saturn V/Apollo combination, which was effectively a giant flying fuel tank. Indeed, so economical was Orion compared to the chemical rockets that the use of the Saturn V booster significantly diluted the system's inherent advantages, with Freeman Dyson estimating that the development of the Saturn V alone would constitute up to 50% of the project's total cost. Furthermore, it was soon determined that it was impossible to build a usable spacecraft that could be launched in a single piece. Up to 3 Saturn V launches would be needed, with the spacecraft components being assembled in orbit. Once assembled, the spacecraft would have allowed a crew of 8 to make a round trip to Mars in 125 days, as opposed to at least 18 months using conventional rockets. Yet despite these enormous advantages, NASA remained wary of the concept. In addition to the secrecy requirements, many worried about the risk of a nuclear pulse unit accidentally detonating or rupturing during liftoff, potentially contaminating a large area with plutonium and causing a public relations disaster. But the main argument against pursuing Orion was a simple lack of resources. Committed to meeting President Kennedy's goal of landing a man on the moon by the end of the decade, NASA had abandoned big-picture approaches to space exploration like Orion and thrown all of its resources behind Project Apollo, which was expedient in the short term but had few long-term applications. Meanwhile, the Air Force became increasingly impatient with NASA's vacillating and pushed to end support for the project. In January 1965, Lieutenant Colonel John R. Burke of the U.S. Air Force Nuclear Power Division wrote that, quote, "Practically every DoD/Air Force and NASA evaluation over the past 3 years prior to 1965 has concluded that Orion provides the only capability for missions well beyond those achievable with chemical or nuclear rocket propulsion. The results point to a technique of rapidly traversing interplanetary distances substantially superior to any other method known today. However, although the Department of Defense supports the concept as being technically sound, without NASA support, the DoD and Air Force will not continue the program. All work on Orion technology will therefore cease in April 1965. In February, General Atomics halted all further research on Orion, limiting its remaining efforts to preparing a final report, while on June 30th, 1965, the Air Force finally terminated funding for the project. After 8 years and $11 million, Project Orion was dead. All future spaceflight programs would make use of chemical, not nuclear rockets. In his article, Death of a Project, Research is Stopped on a System of Space Propulsion Which Broke All the Rules of the Political Game, published in the journal Science in July 1965, Freeman Dyson expressed his frustration with the enormous wasted potential of Orion, declaring that, quote, "This is the first time in modern history that a major expansion of human technology has been suppressed for political reasons." While today Project Orion might seem like a quaint and naive product of Cold War nuclear optimism, in the same vein as electricity too cheap to meter and using atomic bombs to dig harbors and canals, the idea is not nearly as insane as it might first appear. As of this recording, Orion-style nuclear pulse propulsion is still our only feasible means of economically reaching Mars, the outer planets, or even another star, with Freeman Dyson once calculating that an interstellar Orion-type spacecraft could conceivably be propelled to velocities approaching 10% the speed of light, allowing it to reach Alpha Centauri, the closest star to our solar system, in as little as 44 years. Other alternative propulsion systems have been proposed, including laser light sails, solar sails, nuclear fusion and antimatter annihilation engines, and the Bussard ramjet, a giant scoop that gathers up and fuses hydrogen from the interstellar medium as it sails along, but none of these technologies are anywhere near developed enough for practical application. An Orion spacecraft, by contrast, can be built using 1950s technology. Indeed, it might even be our only hope of deflecting an incoming extinction-level comet or asteroid. As Daniel Durda, a senior research scientist at the Southwest Research Institute in Boulder, Colorado, developing such capability is of the utmost importance for humanity to survive in the long run. To quote him, "The worst scenario I can think of is a multi-kilometer diameter, long-period comet discovered several months out on an impact trajectory as it is entering the inner solar system. There is absolutely nothing we could do about it at this point in time. Nothing." And while detonating hundreds of nuclear warheads in the atmosphere in rapid succession might seem like a public health disaster waiting to happen, once again, the reality is rather more encouraging than you might think. Radioactive fallout from a nuclear detonation comes from two main sources: the vaporized remains of the bomb casing and dust, sand, soil, and other materials that are sucked up into the fireball and irradiated. Very little comes from the irradiation of the air itself. Thus, by launching an Orion-style spacecraft from a metal launch pad or barge, much of the latter source can be eliminated. Bomb casing materials can also be selected, or highly efficient nuclear warheads used to further reduce fallout. But even if regular dirty bombs are used, the overall risk to the global population is still remarkably small. Between 1945 and 1980, 5 nuclear nations, the US, Soviet Union, UK, France, and China, conducted a total of 528 above-ground nuclear tests, releasing large amounts of fallout into the atmosphere. According to a study by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia, of the 3.8 million Americans born in 1951 who would have been exposed to the highest fallout levels during their most vulnerable development years, only 1,000 would have suffered additional cancer deaths as a result, an increase of only 0.03%. By comparison, smoking would have killed some 250,000. Indeed, near the end of the project, Freeman Dyson calculated that each Orion launch would kill between 1 and 20 people, a minuscule 0.000000062% of the world population at the time. But even if Orion could be made 100% safe, there's still the sticky problem of the concept requiring thousands of complete, self-actuating nuclear warheads to function. While this, as famed astronomer and science communicator Carl Sagan once suggested, would be an ideal way to dispose of the world's military nuclear stockpiles, it would still create massive national security and nuclear proliferation problems. One solution is to use lasers or particle beams to fission pellets of nuclear fuel, an arrangement that cannot easily be turned into a weapon. A similar concept explored by the British Interplanetary Society's Project Daedalus in 1973 and NASA's Project Longshot in 1989 involves fusing deuterium and helium-3 fuel, which could potentially be mined from Jupiter's atmosphere and other places in the solar system. But until as a species we learn to stop worrying and love the bomb, our forays into the universe will continue to be but a small step instead of a giant leap. Thank you for watching.